Watch a rocket fall out of the sky. Not a crash, a controlled landing. 13 stories of spent booster coming down backward through the dark, engine lit against the black, and up near the top 4 flat panels swing open into the airflow and start to steer. They look like waffle irons. What they do is walk 70 tons of rocket down onto a pad barely wider than the rocket itself until it settles on its legs, upright, ready to fly again. You've seen this. It's the picture of a company in California that tore up the rulebook and built a future nobody else could reach. But those 4 steering panels, the ones doing the hard part of the landing, were invented by a Soviet engineer in the 1950s and kept a military secret until 1985. The most modern thing in the sky is a Cold War hand-me-down, and it isn't the only one. I want to pause on the word invented here, because we use it far too casually. We tend to tell the story as if one company came along and reinvented spaceflight from scratch. And when people explain why, they usually point to the same 3 things: a booster that lands itself, an engine often described as the most advanced ever flown, and a giant rocket with an absurd number of engines packed underneath it, something people once thought would be impossible to control. To be fair, SpaceX did invent something here. I'll get to that later. And ironically, it's more important than the things people usually credit them for. But the 3 things we usually point to as proof that they invented all of this from scratch, they didn't. Soviet engineers were already working on these ideas in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. Some were dismissed as impractical, some were considered outright ridiculous, and in a few cases, the designs were actually ordered destroyed. You won't hear much of this in a launch broadcast. The commentary names the company, names the rocket, and moves on. So stay with me, because I'm not really interested in who deserves the credit. That question is boring. What interests me is something else. What happens when an idea is right, but arrives 40 years too early? To understand, we have to go back to the middle of the Cold War, when American and Soviet engineers were trying to solve the same problem. How do you get more power out of a rocket engine without making it impossibly heavy, complicated, or expensive? By the mid-1960s, American engineers were putting much of their effort into hydrogen. Hydrogen is extremely light and gives you excellent efficiency, and that approach eventually produced the Space Shuttle's main engine, an extraordinary piece of engineering, but an extraordinarily expensive one too. Soviet engineers took a different path. They stuck with cheaper, familiar propellants, kerosene and liquid oxygen. But if they weren't going to get more performance by switching to hydrogen, they had to find another way. Their answer was to make the engine use its own exhaust. Instead of throwing the exhaust from the engine's turbopump system overboard, they routed it back into the main combustion chamber, where it could help produce more thrust. It was a much more complicated way to run an engine, but it squeezed far more performance out of the same basic fuels. The Soviets called this a closed cycle. Here's the basic idea. A rocket engine uses pumps to force fuel and oxygen into its combustion chamber. Those pumps are driven by a turbine, which gets its power from burning a small amount of propellant. Normally, that hot turbine exhaust is thrown away. In a closed-cycle engine, it isn't. The exhaust goes back into the combustion chamber and burns again. You recover energy that would otherwise be wasted, squeezing more performance out of the same propellant. But there's a catch. The combustion chamber is already under enormous pressure. To send the turbine exhaust back into it, that exhaust has to be at an even higher pressure. That's where things get difficult. American engineers who pursued closed-cycle engines used hydrogen, which brought its own challenges. The Soviets took a much more dangerous route. They drove the turbine with extremely oxygen-rich gas at high temperature and pressure. And oxygen that hot can attack the metal inside the turbine itself. You're essentially putting a cutting torch inside your own engine, and then asking that engine to launch a rocket. And here's the part that gets me. This is exactly the kind of problem an engineering team might look at and decide is simply too dangerous and too complicated to be worth pursuing. The Soviets decided to solve it instead. To make an engine survive those conditions, metallurgists in Samara spent years developing alloys that could withstand extremely hot, oxygen-rich gas without burning or corroding. The exact compositions of those alloys became some of the program's most closely guarded secrets, and it worked. They built kerosene-fueled engines that were lighter, more powerful, and more efficient than anything American engineers were willing to attempt at the time. When American engineers saw the performance figures coming out of the Soviet Union, many simply didn't believe them. The numbers seemed too good to be true, and that's the world we enter before this story takes its turn. Soviet engineers were solving problems that other engineers had decided were too difficult or too dangerous to pursue, and they weren't solving just one. They had the oxygen-rich engine. They had the lattice fins that could steer a rocket traveling faster than sound. They had another idea that looked almost ridiculous on paper: put an enormous number of engines under a single rocket and make them work together. That last idea would eventually become one of the program's greatest achievements, and, depending on who you ask, one of the reasons the rocket was ultimately abandoned. Then almost all of it was buried. That's where this story gets dark. The Soviet moon rocket was called the N-1, and its first stage was powered by 30 of those kerosene engines, 24 arranged in an outer ring, with 6 more in the center. And here's the astonishing part: the complete first stage was never tested on the ground. There was no test stand large enough to hold it, and the program didn't have the money to build one. So the first time all 30 engines ever ran together was during an actual launch, with the entire rocket sitting on top of them. To control all those engines, the engineers built an automatic system that could detect a failing engine and shut it down before it caused a larger problem. But the system had a flaw. Its sensors were tuned to a frequency that was almost identical to one of the natural vibration frequencies of the engines, so the controller couldn't reliably tell the difference between a normal vibration and a genuine engine failure. It started shutting down healthy engines. 4 N-1 launches took place between 1969 and 1972. All 4 failed. In 1974, the Soviet moon program was officially canceled. That much is relatively well known. Here's what isn't. The engines weren't simply put into storage. An order came down to destroy them, along with the documents describing them, so the failed moon program could effectively be erased from the record. Even the most advanced engine in the program was abandoned. Its designer, Valentin Glushko, had pushed the closed-cycle concept further than anyone else in the Soviet program. The engine was built and tested on the ground, but it never flew, and the lattice fins suffered a different fate. They remained a classified military technology, hidden from the outside world until the engineer who invented them was finally allowed to publish a book about them in 1985. Now compare that with what was happening in the West at the same time. The reaction to the Soviet engine, at least from the accounts that have survived, wasn't curiosity, it was disbelief. American engineers looked at the Soviet performance figures and concluded that they couldn't be right. The idea of running an engine with extremely oxygen-rich gas seemed so difficult and dangerous that many engineers simply didn't think it was worth pursuing. For years, there was a widespread assumption that the Soviet claims were exaggerated, Cold War propaganda designed to make their rockets look better than they really were. The United States didn't make a serious attempt to develop this kind of oxygen-rich engine until the early 2000s. And this is where I'll stop reporting the history and tell you what I think, because this is the part I can't get past. Some of the most advanced rocket engine technology of its time was sitting in storage or hidden in classified documents. One side had decided it was an embarrassment to be erased. The other had decided it couldn't possibly be real. And for decades, almost nobody tried to find out. That's hard for me to forgive. Behind those buried ideas were 3 men. And since this story is really about them, let me tell you a little about each one. Start with Sergei Bolotserkovsky, the man behind the fins. He led the team that figured out how a grid of tiny metal cells, something that looks more like a screen door than a rocket control surface, could steer an object traveling faster than sound. His fins were used on Soviet missiles, on the N-1 rocket, and on the escape system designed to pull a Soyuz crew capsule away from a rocket that was breaking apart beneath it. In other words, if a Soviet launch went catastrophically wrong with cosmonauts on board, Bolotserkovsky's fins could be part of what got them to safety. In Russia, they're still known as Bolotserkovsky fins. And for decades, almost nobody outside the Soviet military and space programs was even allowed to know they existed. The oxygen-rich engine came out of Nikolai Kuznetsov's design bureau in Samara. His team built the engine that was ultimately ordered destroyed, and they built it exceptionally well. It produced an extraordinary amount of thrust for its weight, about 137 times its own weight in thrust. Then came the order to scrap it. Kuznetsov's response was remarkably simple. His people didn't destroy the engines. They packed them into crates, put them in storage, and let the official records say whatever they were supposed to say. That's why the engines survived. The most ambitious idea came from Valentin Glushko, a full-flow engine that sent all of its fuel and oxygen through the turbines before burning them in the main chamber. It was an extraordinarily difficult design. They built it, they tested it, and then they shelved it. not because it had failed, but because the rocket it was meant to power was canceled. Which brings us back to that booster falling through the darkness over Florida, and to what those supposedly worthless Soviet leftovers were actually worth. By then, 30 engines under one rocket had become the symbol of everything that went wrong with the Soviet moon program. The full-flow engine had never flown, and after 4 N-1 launches and 4 failures, it was hard to argue with the verdict. Then, one by one, someone outside the Soviet system picked those ideas up and made them work. The grid fins came first. SpaceX had spent the previous year trying to land Falcon 9 boosters, first targeting the ocean and then a floating platform. The boosters came down too hard, tipped over, and broke apart. Then, in December 2015, a Falcon 9 booster came down from space and landed upright on solid ground for the first time. And the hardware steering that booster through its descent was something the Soviets had developed decades earlier: grid fins. SpaceX scaled the design up and later switched from aluminum to titanium, allowing the fins to withstand the intense heat of atmospheric re-entry and be flown again and again. Then came the engine cycle. Around 60 of Kuznetsov's engines had survived in that storeroom. When American engineers finally got to examine them in the 1990s, the machines themselves were the proof. The Soviets hadn't been exaggerating. An American company bought 36 of them, the very engines that were supposed to have been destroyed, and put one on a test stand in Sacramento. It hadn't run in roughly 20 years. They fired it. It worked. It hit the performance numbers the Soviet engineers had claimed decades earlier for an engine built by a program that no longer existed in a country that no longer existed. But the West didn't stop at testing the old engines. It bought the technology. The RD-180 was a Russian-developed engine based on the same oxygen-rich staged combustion approach. It went on to power American Atlas launch vehicles for nearly 2 decades. 6 flights on the Atlas III, more than 100 on the Atlas V. The engine cycle that American engineers had once considered too difficult to build ended up carrying American military and intelligence satellites into orbit again and again. It remained in service until Russia cut off the supply in 2022. And then the story came full circle. When SpaceX designed the engine for Starship, the Raptor, it chose the same basic full-flow staged combustion approach that Glushko had pushed decades earlier. Glushko had built and tested his version on the ground, but it never flew. In July 2019, SpaceX's Raptor became the first full-flow staged combustion engine to fly, powering a small test vehicle in Texas that lifted off the pad and landed again. As of today, it remains the only full-flow staged combustion engine to have flown. And then, finally, SpaceX built the most powerful rocket ever flown. 27 engines on Falcon Heavy, 33 on the Super Heavy booster, 3 more than the N-1 ever had. In November 2023, Super Heavy fired all 33 engines at once, producing more thrust than any rocket in history and surpassing the first stage thrust record the N-1 had set half a century earlier. SpaceX could build enormous test stands. It could fire the entire cluster on the ground. It could lose hardware, learn from the failure, build another one, and try again. The Soviets didn't have that luxury. They never had the money, the infrastructure, or the time to test the N-1's complete first stage the way SpaceX could test Super Heavy. Now I owe you the other half of the story, the part that genuinely belongs to the modern company. SpaceX did achieve something the Soviets never did. They took a booster, flew it, landed it, and then flew it again. Not once or twice, but dozens of times. They turned something that had once seemed almost impossible into a routine part of a launch schedule. That's a real achievement, and it belongs to SpaceX. The Soviets proved that many of the individual pieces could work. SpaceX figured out how to combine those pieces into a reusable launch system that could actually operate repeatedly and at a much lower cost than traditional expendable rockets. And I have to be just as honest about the Soviet side, otherwise I'm simply replacing one flattering myth with another. Remember Glushko's full-flow engine, the one I called the deepest idea of all? It never became a working flight engine. It was fired on a test stand, but combustion instability kept damaging the engine. It was tested, but never perfected, and that's an important distinction. There's a big difference between having the right idea and turning that idea into a reliable, working engine. The Soviets got remarkably close to the first. They never fully achieved the second. And Glushko's prototype also used very different and much more difficult propellants from those used by SpaceX's modern Raptor. So what survived from the Soviet work wasn't the hardware itself. It was the concept, the engineering knowledge, and the proof that full-flow staged combustion could be pursued seriously. The same goes for the Soviet decision not to pursue the oxygen-rich engine. That wasn't simply arrogance or incompetence. American engineers had made a deliberate choice to put their resources into hydrogen instead. Hydrogen offered a different set of advantages and came with a different set of problems. It was a fork in the road as much as it was a mistake. So the neat version of the story, that a private company simply stole the future from the Soviets, doesn't hold up. But neither does the opposite story, where SpaceX is merely recycling old Soviet technology. The first generation came up with ideas that were far ahead of their time. The second figured out how to turn some of those ideas into a system that actually worked, repeatedly, in the real world. If you want to see the whole story in a single frame, watch the next big launch. Look at the booster before it leaves the pad. 33 engines underneath it, using a combustion cycle Soviet engineers were working on in the 1960s. 4 lattice fins near the top, based on a Soviet design from the 1950s. The Soviet Union buried the work. Then the Soviet Union disappeared. The ideas didn't. They're still flying today, under a flag their creators never served, and for a company they could never have imagined. The engineers never got to see that. Their work did. That's the kind of story I love. The idea everyone counted out, sitting quietly for decades, only to turn out to have been right. And there are more stories like this hiding in the history of spaceflight than you might think. So subscribe, and I'll keep digging them up.